The dinner party was meant to impress. A wealthy businessman had gathered clients and colleagues at his mansion, boasting that the evening would feature fine dining, like they'd never experienced before. But the moment the chef walked in, the air shifted. She was a black woman, confident in her chef's whites, carrying her knives with practiced ease. Instead of greeting her with respect, the host sneered. He looked her up and down and said loudly, "This is the chef? I asked for a real chef, not some caterer." His tone dripped with arrogance, his words hanging heavy in front of the startled guests. What he didn't know, what he hadn't bothered to ask, was that the woman standing before him wasn't just any cook. She was the owner of 5 thriving restaurants across the country. She was the star of 2 popular television shows watched by millions. She was a chef whose name carried weight in kitchens from New York to Los Angeles. And before the night was over, everyone in that dining room would learn just how badly he had underestimated her. The host of the evening, a wealthy businessman named Charles, prided himself on appearances. Every detail of his life was carefully staged to signal power and superiority. The cars in his driveway, the artwork on his walls, even the imported marble in his dining room. Hosting a dinner party was, for him, less about sharing food and more about showing off. He had told his guests for weeks that they would enjoy a dining experience comparable to the best restaurants in Europe. He had built up expectations, so high that the night felt like an exhibition of his wealth, as much as a dinner. When the chef arrived, she did so with quiet grace, dressed in a clean white jacket and carrying her tools with ease. She walked into the mansion like she had done 1,000 times before. There was no nervousness in her step, no hesitation in her voice when she greeted the staff. Cooking for wealthy clients wasn't new to her. It was a part of her world now. Though it hadn't always been that way, years of hard work had brought her to the top of her industry. And tonight was just another chance to do what she loved most, create a meal that people would never forget. But Charles didn't see any of that. He saw only what he wanted to see. When he laid eyes on her, his face twisted in disbelief. "This is the chef?" he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I asked for a real chef, not some caterer." The room went still. The staff paused mid-step, holding trays and glasses. Some of the guests shifted in their seats, pretending not to notice while their eyes flicked nervously between Charles and the woman he had just insulted. The remark had been casual in tone, but sharp in intent. He wasn't asking a question. He was making a statement, a dismissal wrapped in arrogance. The chef didn't flinch. She met his eyes with calm composure, the same composure she had perfected over years of facing doubt and disrespect in professional kitchens. "Yes, sir," she said evenly. "I'll be preparing your meal tonight," Charles scoffed, shaking his head. "We'll see how that goes. Just keep it simple, all right? No need for anything fancy. These people don't want experiments on their plates." He waved his hand as though dismissing her, already turning back to his guests with a smirk. His words stung, but not because they were new. She had heard them before, in one form or another. Doubts about her talent, her authority, her right to stand in the position she had earned. But each time, she had let her work speak louder than the insults. Tonight would be no different. The staff, who had worked enough events to know when a host had crossed a line, shared uneasy glances. One of them whispered quietly as they passed her in the kitchen. "Sorry about him. He's always like this." She offered a small smile in return and went straight to work. The kitchen became her refuge. She laid out her ingredients, checked the temperatures on the ovens, and organized the courses in her mind. For her, the flow of cooking was like conducting music, each step leading smoothly into the next, building toward a harmony of flavors and textures. Her confidence came not from arrogance, but from years of discipline and passion. Meanwhile, in the dining room, Charles kept up his commentary. He told his guests how difficult it was to find real talent these days, how so many so-called chefs were just television personalities pretending to cook. He smirked at his own joke, unaware of the irony, and his guests forced polite laughter, though some of them were already uncomfortable. They hadn't missed the way he had spoken to the chef, nor the tone he used now. One guest, a woman seated near the head of the table, leaned toward another and whispered, "She looks familiar. I'm sure I've seen her before." Her companion nodded but said nothing, choosing not to fuel the conversation just yet. Back in the kitchen, the chef worked quickly and precisely. The menu she had planned was ambitious. Seasonal ingredients transformed into bold, elegant dishes that showcased both technique and creativity. She plated the first course with care, brushing a sauce across the porcelain like a painter working on a canvas. She wasn't just making food. She was telling a story, one that carried the weight of her journey and the pride of her craft. As she prepared to send the first plates out, she took a steadying breath. She knew exactly how this evening would unfold. She had seen it before. The arrogance of a man convinced of his superiority colliding with the undeniable truth of excellence. The insults would fade into silence, replaced by the one thing even the proudest man couldn't dismiss: the taste of something extraordinary. When the servers carried out the plates, the guests' eyes widened at the presentation alone. Whispers of admiration ran through the room. Even before tasting, they could see this was no ordinary meal. The chef stayed in the kitchen, listening to the faint murmur of approval filtering back through the doors. Charles, however, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Presentation's one thing," he said loudly, so all could hear. "Let's see if it actually tastes like food, not some art project." The guests exchanged uneasy looks once again. His arrogance was grating, his tone dismissive, but none of them dared challenge him outright. Still, there was a growing sense that he was setting himself up for something he wouldn't see coming. And in the kitchen, the chef simply continued to work. Each dish a quiet, deliberate answer to the disrespect she had endured. The first course had been a triumph. Guests leaned over their plates, savoring every bite, whispering praise to one another between sips of wine. The flavors were bright, layered, and unexpected, each ingredient treated with care. Some closed their eyes while tasting, as if they didn't want to miss a single note. But Charles wasn't satisfied. He forced a smile as the others praised the dish, then leaned back and made a show of waving his fork dismissively. "Not bad," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the table. "But honestly, I've had better. This is the sort of thing you get at those trendy little bistros. Cute, sure, but not real cooking." The guests fell silent, caught between their genuine admiration for the food and their host's cutting remarks. A few lowered their eyes, not wanting to be dragged into the conflict. The chef, still in the kitchen, heard none of this directly, but the tension carried in the air when the servers returned. They set down empty plates with small smiles, whispering they loved it. But their eyes hinted at something else, a discomfort they didn't want to voice. Charles wasn't done. He stood from his chair and walked toward the kitchen, pushing through the swinging door without warning. The staff froze mid-step, startled by his sudden presence. The chef glanced up from her work, calm as ever, as Charles approached the counter. "You're really leaning into this whole artistic thing, huh?" he said, pointing to the carefully plated dishes waiting to go out. "I mean, it looks nice, sure, but my guests want real food, not all these sauces and drizzles. Just give us steak and potatoes, something hearty. You know, the kind of thing a real chef would serve." The room went still. His tone was laced with condescension, the words "real chef" dripping with implication. The staff stiffened, glancing nervously between him and the chef, wondering how she would respond. She didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she continued working, her knife moving swiftly through fresh herbs. "I've prepared the menu we agreed on, sir," she said evenly. "Each dish has been crafted with care. I promise your guests will enjoy the full experience." Charles laughed, a harsh sound in the quiet kitchen. "Experience? Don't flatter yourself. They're here because of me, not you. Just don't embarrass me, all right?" He turned on his heel and strode back to the dining room, leaving behind a trail of discomfort. The staff exchanged looks of sympathy with the chef, but she only exhaled softly, steadying her focus. She had endured worse in kitchens where she wasn't respected, where her authority had been challenged daily. Tonight was nothing new. Tonight, she would let her work speak for her. Back at the table, Charles kept up his commentary. As the second course was served, delicate handmade pasta with a sauce that shimmered under the light. He made sure to mock it. "Pasta? Really? This is what we're paying for?" He leaned toward one guest, smirking. "You'd think for the price I'm shelling out, she'd at least try something original." But when the guest took a bite, their expression betrayed them. Their eyes widened, their fork hovered midair, and they whispered, "This is incredible." Charles waved it off, rolling his eyes. "Don't be fooled. These people are great at presentation. It's smoke and mirrors, that's all." His words grated on the room. Guests exchanged glances, their patience thinning. They weren't blind to what was happening. They could taste the brilliance on their plates. Yet here was Charles, determined to tear down the very person responsible. His arrogance wasn't just insulting the chef, it was insulting their intelligence. By the time the third course arrived, the contrast had become impossible to ignore. The chef's dishes grew bolder, richer, each one a masterful balance of flavor. The guests were enchanted, leaning into every bite, eager for what would come next. And yet, Charles doubled down. When servers placed plates of seared duck breast with a cherry reduction before them, he laughed mockingly. "Duck? Who even eats this stuff? This is the kind of nonsense you see on those cooking competition shows. Looks fancy, but it's just pretentious nonsense. One of the guests, finally unable to keep quiet, set down his fork and looked Charles squarely in the eye. With respect, Charles, this is some of the best food I've ever had. Maybe instead of criticizing, you should try appreciating what's in front of you. The table went silent. Charles's face darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. He let out a sharp laugh, trying to mask the sting of being corrected in his own home. All right, he said. No need to get worked up. I'm just saying, let's not act like this is some Michelin-starred experience. But what Charles didn't know, and what the rest of the table was about to discover, was that the woman in his kitchen had already surpassed Michelin stars. She had built an empire of restaurants, each one thriving under her vision. She had captivated millions on television with her talent, charm, and knowledge. She wasn't just a chef, she was a household name. And the moment one guest recognized her, the charade Charles was hiding behind would begin to crumble. The dining room buzzed as the next course made its way out of the kitchen. Servers moved with precision, setting down plates that looked more like works of art than meals. Thin slices of duck gleamed under the chandeliers, a rich cherry glaze glistening across the meat, with roasted vegetables arranged in careful balance. A faint aroma of spice and fruit hung in the air, enticing even before the first bite. The guests leaned forward as the plates were placed in front of them, their curiosity piqued. The first forkful was tentative, almost cautious, but then, as the flavors bloomed on their tongues, tender duck, tangy cherry, the subtle warmth of herbs, their expressions shifted to delight. The room filled with soft hums of approval, the kind of instinctive sounds people make when they taste something extraordinary. This is incredible, one guest murmured, almost to themselves. Another leaned toward their neighbor and whispered, I haven't tasted duck like this since Paris. Compliments flowed in hushed tones, the diners eager but polite, not wanting to overshadow the moment with too much noise. But Charles couldn't stand it. Watching his guests swoon over the food while he sat scowling only fueled his irritation. He stabbed a piece of duck with his fork and shoved it into his mouth, chewing with exaggerated disinterest. Then, as the table waited for his reaction, he shrugged. It's fine. A little too sweet, if you ask me. Honestly, I don't know why people get so worked up over this kind of thing. It's just duck. The words landed heavily. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, some rolling their eyes when Charles wasn't looking. They knew what they were tasting, and it was far more than just duck. His dismissive tone wasn't fooling anyone anymore. As the plates were cleared and replaced with the fourth course, a hush fell across the room. This dish was different. A small, intricate tower of seafood layered with delicate flavors. The colors were vibrant, the presentation meticulous. When guests tasted it, the reactions were even stronger. Murmurs grew louder, forks clinked eagerly against plates, and smiles spread across the table. One guest, a man known for his sharp palate, set his fork down and said aloud, This is world-class cooking. Whoever is in that kitchen has more talent than half the chefs I've met in New York. The compliment hung in the air, bold and unashamed. Several others nodded, voicing their agreement. Charles, however, bristled. He let out a sharp laugh, trying to turn the moment into a joke. World-class? Don't get carried away. This is home cooking dressed up in fancy clothes. You all really need to get out more if you think this is top-level cuisine. But no one laughed with him. His guests were beginning to see the contrast more clearly than ever. His arrogance, loud and baseless, versus the chef's undeniable skill, expressed through every bite of food they tasted. Back in the kitchen, the chef kept her focus. She wasn't concerned with Charles's comments. She had seen the servers' faces as they returned with empty plates and glowing feedback. She knew the food was landing exactly as she intended it to. Her goal wasn't to win Charles's approval. It was to give his guests an unforgettable evening. And by the looks of things, she was succeeding. The fifth course brought a dish that would push the evening over the edge. A perfectly seared fillet, accompanied by a truffle-infused puree and a sauce that shimmered under the light. When the plates hit the table, the aroma alone made guests pause. They picked up their knives and cut into the meat, which yielded effortlessly, juices glistening on the plate. The reactions were instant and unanimous. Murmurs gave way to open exclamations. This is unreal, one guest declared. Another raised their glass and said, This chef knows exactly what she's doing. The room warmed with laughter and appreciation, the atmosphere transforming from tense politeness to genuine enjoyment. Charles, however, was unraveling. Each compliment felt like a blow. He forced down bites of the fillet, muttering under his breath, his face tightening as though he were enduring a punishment. Finally, unable to contain himself, he slammed his fork onto the plate. "All right, enough," he barked, startling the table into silence. "Everyone's acting like this is the best meal of their lives. Let's not pretend, okay? It's food, nothing more. And frankly, I could have had a better steak at half the restaurants in this city." The outburst hung in the air, heavy and awkward. Guests exchanged glances, some raising their eyebrows, others shaking their heads slightly. The tension was back, but now it was directed at Charles, not the chef. It was then that one woman at the table leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied the plate in front of her. She looked thoughtful, almost hesitant, before she spoke. "Wait a second," she said slowly, turning her gaze toward the kitchen doors. "I know this food. I've seen it before. This style, it's hers." The table turned toward her in curiosity. "Whose?" another guest asked. The woman's eyes lit up with recognition. "The chef on television. The one with the 2 shows. I'm sure of it. This is her food. This is her signature." A murmur swept the room, guests leaning in closer, their curiosity piqued. Someone else nodded, recalling an episode they had seen. Another whispered the name of one of her restaurants, realizing they had dined there before. All eyes drifted toward the kitchen, anticipation building. The chef, still focused on the next course, was unaware that the reveal had already begun in the dining room. Charles, however, paled. He looked from guest to guest, shaking his head quickly. "No, absolutely not. Don't be ridiculous. She's just a cook I hired. That's all." But his words rang hollow, and the doubts had already planted themselves firmly in the minds of his guests. If the woman in his kitchen was who they thought she was, then everything Charles had said tonight, every insult, every dismissal, would come crashing down on him in the most public, humiliating way possible. And the next course, the one she was preparing now, would confirm the truth. The dining room was alive with whispers now. Guests leaned toward one another, murmuring the same thought. They knew this food. It wasn't just good. It was distinctive, familiar, and instantly recognizable to those who had dined in the best restaurants or followed culinary television. The woman who had first spoken leaned back in her chair with growing certainty. "It's her. I'm telling you, I saw her make a dish like this on her show just a few months ago." Another guest, a younger man, pulled out his phone under the table, quickly scrolling. He glanced at the photo he pulled up, then looked toward the kitchen. His eyes widened. "She's right," he whispered, showing the screen to the guest beside him. "It is her." The confirmation spread like wildfire, and within moments the entire table was buzzing. They weren't just eating a nice meal prepared by a private chef. They were dining on dishes crafted by a culinary icon. Then the kitchen doors opened, and she stepped out. The room fell quiet instantly, anticipation hanging in the air. She carried herself with calm assurance, her jacket spotless, her presence commanding without effort. Her eyes scanned the table, taking in the guests' eager faces, before settling briefly on Charles. He sat rigid in his chair, his face pale, his jaw tight. A thin sheen of sweat had appeared on his forehead, though the room was perfectly cool. The woman who had recognized her was the first to speak. "It is you," she said, her voice almost reverent. "Your chef." She said the name aloud, and immediately heads nodded all around the table. Recognition clicked into place. Gasps followed, along with a ripple of applause from a few guests who couldn't contain their excitement. "I watch your show every week," one woman exclaimed. Another leaned forward, eyes sparkling. "I ate at your restaurant in Chicago last year. It was one of the best meals of my life." The chef smiled warmly, inclining her head in gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying easily in the quiet room. "I'm glad you've enjoyed my work." Charles tried to interject, forcing a laugh that sounded strained. All right, let's not get carried away. So she's been on TV, big deal. Anyone can get on television these days. That doesn't make her a real chef." The words rang hollow, and the guests knew it. Several of them turned toward him with open disapproval. One man, a longtime investor who rarely spoke at such gatherings, finally said, "Charles, with all due respect, you've been insulting her all evening. And now we learn she owns 5 restaurants and hosts 2 shows? That's more than any chef I know personally. She's not just a real chef, she's one of the best in the country." The table erupted in agreement. Nods and murmurs of support surrounding the chef as she stood quietly, letting their voices carry the moment. Charles's face darkened. "I didn't mean, look, I was just joking around," he stammered. No need to make such a fuss, but his excuses didn't land. The chef finally spoke again, her tone calm but resolute. "Respect isn't a joke," she said. "I've worked in kitchens since I was 17. I've spent years proving myself in an industry where people like me are rarely given a chance. I've opened 5 restaurants, each one a reflection of my team's hard work and my passion. I've dedicated my life to food, not for fame, but because I believe in what it can do. Bring people together, create joy, tell stories. Her words struck like a knife through the arrogance that had filled the room earlier. Guests nodded, their admiration deepening. She continued, her eyes never leaving Charles. So when you look at me and say I'm not a real chef, what you're really saying is that the years I've put in, the sacrifices I've made, the people I've led and taught and fed, none of that matters to you. But the truth is, it matters to them. She gestured toward the table, where her dishes sat half-eaten, yet cherished. It matters to every person who's ever walked into one of my restaurants. It matters to every young cook who looks at me and sees what's possible. The silence that followed was heavy but electric. It wasn't the silence of awkwardness anymore. It was the silence of awe. One guest finally broke it with a firm clap, then another, and soon the entire table erupted into applause. Genuine, heartfelt applause, the kind that fills a room and leaves no doubt about where the respect truly lies. Charles sat motionless, his face burning. Each clap was a reminder of his failure, each cheer a blow to his pride. He had walked into the evening believing himself the center of attention, the orchestrator of every detail. Now, he was invisible, overshadowed by the very woman he had dismissed. The chef bowed her head slightly in gratitude before returning to the kitchen, leaving behind a table of inspired, energized diners, and one host crumbling beneath the weight of his own arrogance. The truth was out. The reveal had shattered any illusion Charles tried to maintain. His insults had been exposed for what they were, the desperate attempts of a man threatened by greatness he couldn't control. And the night wasn't over yet. The applause lingered even after the chef slipped back into the kitchen. The air in the dining room had shifted completely. Guests leaned into one another, voices brimming with admiration as they spoke about her shows, her restaurants, her unmistakable talent. The focus of the evening had turned entirely toward her brilliance, leaving Charles in the shadows of his own event. For a man like him, who thrived on control and attention, the shift was unbearable. His face was flushed, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. He forced a brittle laugh, desperate to reclaim his authority. "All right, everyone, settle down," he said, his voice strained. "Let's not forget why we're here. This is my dinner party, after all." But the words rang hollow. His guests barely acknowledged him. They were too busy trading stories about the chef, where they had seen her, the dishes they remembered, the impact she had left on them. Charles slammed his hand on the table, the sound sharp and jarring. The room fell silent, eyes turning toward him. "Enough of this," he snapped. "She's just a cook I hired. Don't act like she's some kind of savior. I brought you here to enjoy an evening, not to fawn over someone who should be in the kitchen, not the spotlight." The gasps were immediate. A woman at the far end of the table set down her glass with a clink, her expression a mix of shock and anger. "Charles," she said firmly, "you've been nothing but rude all night. Do you even hear yourself? She's not just a cook. She's one of the most respected chefs in the country, and she has more grace in how she carries herself than you've shown in this entire evening." Another guest, emboldened, added, "Frankly, this meal has been the highlight of my year. If anything, she's the reason I'll remember this night, not you." The sting of those words was visible on Charles's face. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the kitchen doors swung open again. The chef walked out, carrying the final course herself. It was dessert, delicate, intricate, a masterpiece of color and texture. She moved with quiet confidence, setting plates down one by one, her presence commanding the room without effort. When she reached Charles, she placed the plate gently in front of him. "For you, sir," she said softly, her tone polite but resolute. Charles sneered, trying to mask his unease. "Don't think this makes up for your attitude." She tilted her head slightly, her eyes calm and unwavering. "Respect isn't about making up for anything. It's about how we treat each other, no matter the circumstances." Her words landed like a blow, not shouted, but spoken with the quiet authority of someone who knew her worth. The table erupted in applause again, louder this time, more defiant. Guests raised their glasses in her honor, voices overlapping as they toasted to her talent, her career, her dignity. Charles sat frozen, his face red, his body stiff. He tried to laugh along, tried to mask the humiliation, but it was no use. Everyone could see it now. The proud host had been reduced to nothing more than a bitter man caught in his own arrogance. One guest leaned toward him, voice low but sharp. "You wanted to show off tonight, Charles. Well, you did, just not in the way you expected." The chef smiled graciously, thanking her guests as they continued to shower her with admiration. She didn't gloat, didn't raise her voice, didn't stoop to Charles's level. She simply stood tall in her truth, letting the moment speak for itself. Charles, on the other hand, shrank deeper into his chair. His attempts at control had collapsed entirely, and now he was left to stew in the wreckage of his own making. When dessert was finished, several guests approached the chef directly, asking for photos, expressing gratitude, and even inquiring about reservations at her restaurants. She responded with warmth and professionalism, every bit the star they recognized her to be. Charles tried one last time to reclaim the night, standing abruptly and clapping his hands. "Well," he said loudly, forcing a grin, "I think we've all had enough excitement for one evening. Thank you for coming." But the guests didn't rise immediately. They lingered with the chef, speaking to her, praising her, making it clear who had truly left an impression. By the time they finally did leave, the balance of power in that room had shifted permanently. Charles's mansion, his wealth, his status, all of it seemed smaller now, diminished in the shadow of the dignity and excellence that had stood quietly in his kitchen. And as the last guest shook her hand and said, "You were the best part of this evening," Charles realized the truth he couldn't escape. He had set out to impress, but he was the one who had been put on display, not for his wealth, not for his success, but for his arrogance and his downfall. The fallout from that night traveled far beyond Charles's mansion. Within days, whispers of the dinner began to circulate in his social circle. Guests retold the story with relish, describing how the man who tried to belittle his chef was publicly outshone by her brilliance. What was meant to be his showpiece evening had turned into a tale of his arrogance and her triumph. Charles's reputation took the hardest hit. Colleagues and associates who had once tolerated his arrogance now saw it for what it was: insecurity masked by wealth. The humiliation of being dismissed at his own dinner became a running joke, one he could never quite escape. The chef, on the other hand, walked away stronger. Her restaurant saw a surge in reservations. Her shows drew even more viewers. And people praised not just her food, but her composure in the face of such blatant disrespect. She didn't need to defend herself with anger. Her work and her name spoke louder than anything Charles could have said. For the guests who had been there, the evening became unforgettable. Not because of Charles's grand estate or his displays of wealth, but because they had witnessed what real excellence looked like. They saw the difference between entitlement and earned respect. As for Charles, he learned the hardest way possible that status doesn't buy admiration. Respect can't be demanded, it must be earned. And that night, it was clear to everyone in the room who truly deserved it. The man with the mansion had tried to make her small. Instead, he exposed just how small he really was.